Hey gang, how's it going? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel, and today we are talking about the Equality Act and why it actually does the opposite of what its name says that it does. So the LGBTQIA2 movement, it's come a long way in the last 50 years since the Stonewall riots, especially since the 21st century. Back in 2004, Bill O'Reilly was able to go onto his show on Fox and say publicly that the United States would never accept gay marriage. And then came the Obergefell decision in 2015, just 11 years later. In 2014, Time magazine featured Laverne Cox on its cover as the face of the transgender community and stated that transgender rights were the next frontier of the civil rights movement. And since that time, we've had India Moore as the first transgender model for Elle magazine. We've had Jared Polis elected as the first openly gay governor of a state, in this case Colorado. And of course, we have our very own Mayor Pete Buttigieg as the second openly gay presidential contender for the 2020 presidential election. And yet, in spite of all this progress, there are still voices that say that the gay community is still being discriminated against. In May of 2017, Sojal Singh and Jennifer Durso published a report on that very topic, and it said, quote, "Between 11% and 28% of LGB workers report losing a promotion simply because of their sexual orientation, and 27% of transgender workers report being fired, not hired, or denied a promotion in the past year. Discrimination also routinely affects LGBT people beyond the workplace, sometimes costing them their homes, access to education, and even the ability to engage in public life." Looking specifically at transgender people in particular in the public square, their report stated, quote, "Discrimination, harassment, and violence against LGBT people, especially transgender people, has always been common in places of public accommodation. This survey asked transgender respondents whether they had avoided places of public accommodation from January 2016 through January 2017 during a nationwide attack on transgender people's rights. Among transgender survey respondents, 25.7% reported avoiding public places such as stores and restaurants, versus 9.9% of cisgender LGB respondents. 10.9% reported avoiding public transportation versus 4.1% of cisgender LGB respondents. 11.9% avoided getting services they or their family needed versus 4.4% of cisgender LGB respondents. 26.7% made specific decisions about where to shop versus 6.6% of cisgender LGB respondents. And studies and reports like that have been backed up with personal stories, such as that of Carter Brown, who claimed that he was fired from his job after it was outed that he was actually transgender, or the story of Randall McGill and his fiancée, Jose Chavez, who claimed that an Uber driver told them to stop kissing because Uber had a policy of PDA. Which is why on May 17th of this year, the House of Representatives actually passed the so-called Equality Act, which expands the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you actually read the bill, it's kind of boring, FYI, that's basically what it does, simply stating that the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity will be included amongst the other protected categories already listed in the 1964 bill. And since discrimination against people as people is always wrong, period, full stop, this shouldn't be a big deal, right? We should all be able to come together and say that the equivalent of Jim Crow laws against LGBTQIA2 plus people is wrong, whether it's the 21st century or not. And according to the Public Religion Research Institute, 71% of Americans actually agree with this. So everything is good, right? Well, don't pop the champagne cork just yet, because the Equality Act, it's not exactly going to promote equality. In fact, it's going to do just the opposite. It's going to promote ideological tyranny. And one of the biggest areas where it's going to do that is in the area of religious liberty. Section 3A4 states that sexual orientation and gender identity are now included in the Civil Rights Act prohibition on segregation and discrimination in public accommodations, which are defined as follows. Any establishment that provides a good service or program, including a store, shopping center, online retailer, or service provider, salon, bank, gas station, food bank, service or care center, shelter, travel agency, or funeral parlor, or establishment that provides healthcare, accounting, or legal services. Translated, this means that every business and business owner, not just public services like ambulances and the police force, from Jeff Bezos to Grandpa George, who owns the mom and pop bakery down the street, are going to have to cater to LGBT customers in whatever they want, even if that means what they want violates the owner's religious beliefs. Like the classic example, an LGBT pair walks in asking for a wedding cake, even though the owner doesn't believe in gay marriage because he happens to be an Orthodox Christian or Jew or Muslim. But come on, Nate, that's not going to happen. The First Amendment would never allow it. And besides, religious believers are protected with legislation like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Except that they're not. Section 1107 of the Equality Act states specifically that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, passed in 1993 with bipartisan support, and which forbade the government from interfering with the rights of religious practitioners, quote, shall not provide a claim concerning or a defense to a claim under a covered title or provide a basis for challenging the application or enforcement of a covered title, unquote. Translation, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act isn't going to pull your bacon out of the fire when you are asked to do something that violates your religious beliefs in the confines of your business and in the public square. This is, to put it bluntly, terrifying because it means that religious believers won't be able to live out their faith in the public square, even though religious liberty is a natural right, meaning that every single person has it because of their human nature. James Madison actually explained why it's a natural right the best when he said, quote, it is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent, both in order of time and in degree of obligation, to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe, unquote. In other words, since society, or we could replace that with the government for today's purposes, didn't create us, or the rest of reality for that matter, but a supernatural creator did, assuming that you're a religious believer of some stripe, our duties to that creator, whoever or whatever that might be, as detailed in our religion, come before our duties to civil society, much like our duties to our family come before our responsibilities at work. Because before we were a member of whatever company we work at, or even part of the workforce, we were a member of our family. And the fulfillment of our duties to our Creator are vital because that's the way that we stay united with the source of our being. Again, if you're a religious believer. When the government says, for example, you shall bake a gay wedding cake, even though that will violate your beliefs as an Orthodox Christian, Jew, Muslim, etc., what the government is doing is it's replacing the supernatural creator, God, with itself. And that's dangerous, first of all, because the government ain't God. I mean, it can't even protect itself, and it can't even solve the problems of its own people. Secondly, because that gives the government inordinate power over our lives. A government that has the power to decide which religious obligations I can fulfill and which religious beliefs I can hold, and at the same time can decide that Mr. A has a right to a wedding cake? What sort of a right is that even anyway? Is it a natural right, a civil right, a legal right? And that this right of his trumps my natural right to religious liberty is a government that really has no checks upon it at all. Which means that it really doesn't have any limits or boundaries on any of its power. Instead of the government being the servant of the people, remember that line from the Declaration of Independence that says governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed? The government instead becomes the master of the people. But maybe you're not particularly religious, and maybe because of that you think that you're going to be able to slide under the radar. Don't hold your breath on that. It's a safe bet that if the government replaces God with itself, and it forces religious people to violate their beliefs, you're going to be forced to violate some of your beliefs sooner or later. To take just one example, pronouns. Misgendering people is actually now considered discriminatory and harassment in some progressive meccas. In May 2016, the Washington Post reported that New York City's human rights law, quote, requires employers, landlords, and all businesses and professionals to use an employee's, tenant's, customer's, or client's preferred name, pronoun, and title, regardless of the individual's sex assigned at birth, anatomy, gender, medical history, appearance, or the sex indicated on the individual's identification, unquote. Doesn't matter if you know that an XX chromosome makes a gal, or that an XY chromosome makes a guy. If a biological male identifies as a woman and wants to be referred to as her and she, then it is your job to refer to him as her and she. To hell with what biology says, and to hell with what you think. But it gets even worse because the law states that you have to abide by a person's preferred pronouns. You add that requirement to the fact that there are now 57 different recognized genders, and that means that anybody could create pronouns out of thin air, and then the pressure is all on you to remember them and use them, or, face a fine of $125,000 to $250,000. And since misgendering is seen as a form of discrimination, and the whole point of the Equality Act is to stamp out discrimination against TTQQTSA, it's a pretty safe bet that it would take ideas similar to NYC's and plaster them all across the rest of the country. What this all does is it destroys liberty and it destroys equality. As we've seen, it destroys liberty because it hollows out religious liberty so much that whatever remains is just what the state allows to remain, and because it forces everyone to follow the orthodoxy of the state, whatever that orthodoxy happens to be on any given week, whether you like it or not. And equality, because while some people will be able to believe what they want, some people will be able to bring their beliefs into the public square and have the protection of the government behind them, other people will not. If you're part of the LGBTQIAA community or one of its allies, you will be more equal than other people. And that situation is incompatible to a free society, especially one that is supposed to rule itself. Unless, of course, we radically redefine what a free society is. And just to top it all off, the LGBT community, the very group of people that this Equality Act is supposed to help, they are going to find that their freedom is also erased by this bill. What? Let me explain. The Equality Act doesn't define sex as a biological reality, but instead says that it's an alchemical brew of sex stereotype, sexual orientation and identity, and sex characteristics. What that means is that what and who you are doesn't depend on objective facts, but instead on presentation. And that leads to a whole bunch of problems right then and there. For example, in the category of woman, there are a lot of different women, like flirts, tomboys, old-fashioned girls, etc. You get the idea. And each one dresses slightly differently and behaves kind of differently. That's how we're actually able to tell if a woman is a tomboy or not. So if you're a man who thinks that he's a woman, what sort of woman are you, and then what stereotype do you have to squeeze yourself into in order to become that type? Or again, if you're already a woman, but for example, a lesbian, what sort of stereotype, what sort of actions, and what sort of presentation do you have to take on in order to become that? Or if you're one of the 57 different genders, what sort of stereotypes fit in with any one of those different genders? And who decides what these stereotypes are to begin with? In other words, making sex dependent on sex stereotypes and sex characteristics, orientation, and identity, it actually forces people to be chained to a stereotype. Ironically, when you try to free people from their biological sex, you force them to actually become chained to a stereotype. To use myself as one example, I'm a biological male, which means that I have to be a man. But within the parameters of that requirement, there's a lot of room to maneuver. So I can go out and play and tussle with my dog, and then come in and play the piano with one hand and chess with the other. I can learn how to waltz, and I can learn how to throw a punch. I can learn how to cook, and I can learn how to survive in the wilderness with first aid, fire making skills, etc. What I am is not dependent on my clothes, my body language, or my likes and dislikes. What I am, a male, a man, has already been determined, and so if I want to, I can go off script. I'm not chained to a stereotype. And then there's the problem of the government. If sex isn't determined by biology, but by a list that was created somewhere on Capitol Hill, then that means that it's not very solid. which means that that list and our whole idea and definition of sex could change at the whim of some nameless bureaucrat who just needs to justify his job and his existence. Again, the government will have replaced itself for God, and by doing so, will have taken for itself inordinate power over our lives. As always, what say you? Will the Equality Act actually create a caste system that is going to destroy freedom and equality? Or is it, or something like it, actually necessary to protect LGBT Americans? But can it be done in a way that doesn't destroy other people's freedoms? As always, let me know your thoughts, your ideas down in the comment section below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, then don't forget to show your support by giving it a like and sharing it with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media platforms. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a different POV, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to ring the bell for notifications, so that you will always know when I post new videos just like this every Tuesday, videos that you're not going to want to miss. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed to my channel. I appreciate each and every one of you. I truly do. And I will see you all again here next week, gang, on top of the stone. Ciao.